My guest today is Ashley Riley Sousas. Thank you for coming to this podcast. And why don't you tell me what we are going to talk about today? Because it's quite a specific topic.
Yeah, well, you'd asked me to come on and talk about Native American history. And my area of research specialization is not a very common area of research
Yeah, I
specialization.
found out about that.
I specialize in the history of Indigenous California. Um, so I could talk very generally about Native American history, but if you want the really juicy details, probably talking about my research is going to be the place to start.
Yeah, of
And
course.
thank you for having me. This is really exciting.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
It's an honor. So why specifically the California indigenous tribe and not
So
just general Native
yeah,
American history?
so I was definitely interested in general Native American history, and so my family, like a lot of white families from the American South, my dad was born and raised in for his early childhood in Oklahoma. Believed that we had Cherokee ancestry. So, like a lot of white kids with Southern roots,
Yeah,
I wanted to learn more about that, and so I got interested in Native American history. And one of the first things that you learn as a white person who becomes interested in Native American history is that you're really not Cherokee. Your family's history is just legend. It's not real.
yeah.
So I was quickly disabused of the notion that I had this Cherokee ancestry on my dad's side of the family. But
This way to know. What do you? How do you feel about those tests that says you're like 3% to black, you're 5% Hispanic? How do you feel about those tests?
so I've taken one. My dad took one. I think that in my family, that family members were really hoping that there would be some
Yeah,
DNA connection to Native American ancestry. We have
yeah,
none. We have none, which I knew. I knew when I took the test
yeah,
that would be the case. Um, but there, it was interesting for me because, especially on my mother's side of the family, her ancestry was shrouded in mystery. So it was just really interesting to kind of like take the test and realize, yeah, there's really not a lot of mystery about where we come
yeah,
from. My mother was, almost all Portuguese.
yeah.
My father was almost all British Isles. Nothing surprising. Um, so those tests are kind of fun, but
Are they accurate at all, or do you think there is some?
well, if I, I'm not a scientist. I mean, it seems accurate to me. I mean, it confirmed what I suspected.
Yeah,
It confirmed, the obvious, I think, in my family.
yeah,
As far as people using them to try to determine, hey, am I actually Native American? I think one of the most important things that folks need to keep in mind is that, you're belonging in a community of people, you're
yeah,
belonging in a culture is not determined by your DNA.
yeah,
Um, and really, there is very little connection that you can achieve with a modern day indigenous tribal nation, indigenous community through your DNA. It can be an interesting thing to kind of learn about your family and speculate about your family's history. Or if you do genealogy, that's kind of fun to have, some places that your DNA can point you to
yeah.
research. But generally speaking, I know that there are, a lot of Native folks are just like, yeah, keep your take your DNA test and go home,
Yeah.
and can't blame them.
So it was
But
because
I,
of your
I totally did
family's
one.
interest that you got into Native American history.
Yeah, so I was really lucky that I went to a university for my undergraduate degree that had an excellent Native American Studies program. So I have to give a shout out to the University of California at Davis. Their Native American Studies program was top notch. Um, and so I became interested in sort of broader questions in Native American history because of that. I took some excellent classes with some Native historians at UC Davis. And ultimately, when it came time for me to do my PhD and decide on a dissertation topic, my PhD advisor gave me a really, really excellent piece of advice. He said, Ashley, make sure that whatever dissertation topic you decide, that the sources that you're going to need to research for that topic are in a location on Earth that you would like to be. And so I was born and raised in California, and I was like, well, I want to be in California. So I kind of turned that into a California history topic.
Yeah.
And really what it boiled down to was I was really interested in where I had come from. And I tried to settle on a topic that was as close to where I was born and grew up in California as possible. And so I settled on the history of the indigenous communities surrounding a settler colony in Central California called New Helvetia.
Yeah.
And you're gonna have to give me just a second. Somebody is pounding on my door.
No
I'm
worries.
so sorry.
No worries at all. So yeah, I'm sorry about the little bit quiet, but personal problems, it happens. It is just a live recording, and yeah.
Yep. There we
Yeah,
go.
no worries.
I'm set.
I'm just trying to keep it. Yeah, carry on.
Yeah. So the native communities that were associated with this colony, they're from two distinct language groups. One is the Plains Miwok language group, and the other is the Valley Nisenan language group. And these particular groups of communities, I guess we should call them, were sort of organized into what anthropologists call, or I should say used to call, tribelets, so like mini tribes. But really the way they were organized politically was on a town by town basis. So a principal town and its sort of suburban outlying villages constituted one unit, right? And they shared a common culture and a common language with other towns and suburbs across this region in Central California along the American River for the Valley Nisenan and the Sacramento River, and along in the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta for the Plains Miwok. So I study these two sort of linguistic groups in their relationship with this colony in Central California, New Helvetia.
Are they still here today, or are they extinct?
That's a great question. So the individual towns and communities are no longer in their original places. But for example, there is a federally recognized tribe in California, the Ione Band of Miwok Indians, that is descended from many of these Plains Miwok speaking villages in the Sacramento Delta. One of the really interesting things that I uncovered as I was doing my research is that in Central California, a lot of the modern day tribal nations that are still there are what anthropologists call coalescent communities, meaning that these were communities that came together as tribal nations, as kind of like survivors, almost like refugees of other communities that had collapsed, particularly during the California Gold Rush.
So they united together.
Exactly. So I studied like these two language groups that lived in these regions in the 19th century prior to the gold rush. And then I follow their histories into the 20th century when these societies sort of fall apart and then coalesce again as different.
And then modernize
groups. Yeah, so the two kind of key tribal nations that modern day iterations of tribal nations that I research pretty heavily are the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians in El Dorado County, California, and the Mechoopda tribe in Butte County, California, in the town of Chico. So these are like kind of somewhat remote Northern California communities. But of course, these folks did not necessarily exist in these places as these tribal groupings in, say, 1850, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah. But when they united together, was it internal conflict, or did it go? I assume it didn't go smoothly as we imagined it would.
Yeah, so the California gold rush was incredibly devastating to indigenous
Yeah.
communities throughout Northern California. So New Helvetia is the name of this colony. Most people kind of commonly think of it by its more colloquial name, Sutter's Fort. And if you're familiar at all with the California Gold Rush, and I think you
I'm a
are because
little.
I'm
We
pretty
actually
sure
had
you've
an
interviewed.
episode. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm a little
Um,
bit familiar. Yeah,
yeah, so you know that the gold discovery was made at Sutter's Fort,
yeah.
right? It was made at a sawmill, rather. So Sutter's Fort, New Helvetia, is like the epicenter of the California gold rush. And although the gold is mined from the foothills that are a little bit distant from the heart of the colony, from the fort that was at the heart of the colony, um, the fort and the colony become a place where uh, white settlers from all over, well, settlers of all kinds from
Yeah,
all over the United States um, stop as they're passing through on their way to the gold mines.
yeah.
So it really becomes like the heart of the gold country, even though Sutter's Fort is not in a gold producing area. Um, it becomes like this stopover point. And it's really devastating for the native communities because in the late 1840s, early 1850s, as the gold rush is heating up, gold miners and California territorial and state officials truly believe that there's no part of California that doesn't have gold lurking just under the surface. So
Were the many white people living there before the gold rush, or was there no one, not much at all?
no, so the vast majority of the California population prior to the gold rush was indigenous. Um, there were, I don't know, 6,000 or so Mexican settlers living in California at the time of the gold rush, and probably another 6,000 or so, I guess, immigrants to Mexican California from other parts of the world, including the United States, England, Germany, Switzerland, Ireland, all over the place.
Yeah.
Hawaii, that becomes another topic of my research. So there's a really small non-Indigenous population and a much larger, maybe as many as 100,000 Indigenous people living in California as of the time of the gold rush.
Were there other
Um,
tribes coming from further east in America as well as the settlers came further west, or was there, if you know what I mean, trying to refer to?
yeah. So for the majority of folks who from outside of Mexican California that come to California prior to the gold rush, so before there's
Yeah,
any gold, people who are coming to
yeah,
California for other reasons, a lot of them are connected to the hide and tallow trade, the trade in cowhides and beef tallow for candle making.
yeah,
And they come via merchant ships, particularly from places like Boston. There are overland immigrants that come over the California Trail, or they come across the Santa Fe Trail and then up north through north into Northern California from Southern
yeah.
California via the Santa Fe Trail. So yeah, it's a pretty remote. Prior to the gold rush, California is like the end of the earth. Certainly, Spain and then Mexico believed it to be like their sort of like their equivalent of Siberia, right? Like a place that you would get banished to or
Yeah,
exiled to. Which is deeply ironic because I think the consensus today is that California is beautiful and the climate
yeah.
is gorgeous, right? Everybody wants to live there, but back then, not at all. So the gold rush really brings in California's first major population boom. I remember in the podcast episode about the gold rush,
Yeah,
you guys talked about boom towns,
yeah,
and all of like so much of California was a boom state. It was a boom region.
yeah,
Tens of thousands of people showing up in a period of a couple of years was a pretty quick migration, considering the very very small population of non-indigenous people prior to the gold rush.
How did this affect sorry if I can't say the word right, indigenous people when they are already living there? How did this have an effect on them?
So I kind of come in full circle here. So these folks who come to California for gold are like convinced that every square inch of California has gold just underneath the soil.
Yeah, yes.
And so what they want to do is they want to like get Indians off the land because they want to have access to the land for mining purposes. But where then do they go? Like, if you're going to remove Indians, where are you going to put them?
Yeah.
I mean, and this is to say nothing of the fact that, of course, Indians don't want to go. Like, the indigenous people of California are like not looking to move, right? They're not.
They
looking
lived
to
there for
their...
hundred thousands of years already.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the earliest sort of point in time where anthropologists and archaeologists can say, like, yes, there was, you know, human habitation in California, in Northern California, in the regions that we're talking about. I mean, this goes back like 20,000 years.
Yeah.
So folks have been pretty well established here for
a long
time. But if you can't, if there's no part of California that you're willing to say, hey, we're going to give up this portion and try to put Indians on reservations, right?
Yeah.
Then what's going to happen? So what ends up happening is that the state at first does nothing, and it sort of becomes like open season on indigenous people in the mining regions. If you don't want to have to compete with indigenous people over land, over resources, it's almost just, people decide it's easier just like to kill Indian people rather than attempt to either live alongside them, compete with them economically, or attempt to remove them.
Or they could just have employed them as cheap labor.
So initially, like right after the gold was discovered in 1848, because there's almost a year between the time that gold is discovered and the time that the president of the United States at the time makes the announcement that gold has been discovered. So there's like this year in 1848 where only really like local people know that there's gold to be mined, and anybody who has money to invest in trade goods is buying up cloth, they're buying up beads, they're buying up metal tools and implements, and they are paying indigenous workers to go into the gold mines and, you know, the mining regions and pan gold and bring back that gold in exchange for trade goods.
Yeah.
So the very first gold miners in California were indigenous Californians, and they were working for what, you know, Europeans or white Americans saw as trinkets. But in the case of something like beads, indigenous people saw it as cash. Indigenous Californians used beads as a form of currency. So gold meant nothing, but beads were cash. And so folks went to work and they pulled out a bunch of gold from the mining regions and made some white settlers in California really rich. So for example, John Bidwell, who was for a time California's senator to the United States Senate, prominent old sort of California settler, his Rancho Arroyo del Chico, becomes sort of like the basis for the town of Chico and the basis for the university, the land base for the university, California State University, Chico. So he's a really prominent, wealthy guy. He made his fortune in that early trade with Native people in exchange for panning out gold.
But
so yeah, so to answer your question,
yeah.
Cheap labor was sort of the first idea that white folks in California had for, like, you know, what does the gold rush have to do with Indians? Oh, okay, here's a way to make profit through Indian labor in these mining regions. But as more and more, especially white Americans, began arriving in California, you have to remember that the United States in 1849 had just undergone Indian removal. So the Cherokee Trail of Tears, for example. So by 1849, 1850, it's really clear to Americans that white Americans don't live side by side with indigenous people. So they arrive in California and they're like, we're not really interested in Indian labor. What we're really interested in is Indian land.
Yeah. Do we have an idea where they came from, the first indigenous people of California, like how they wandered into and settled down in California? Can you tell us a little bit about this?
So this deep prehistory is not my area of expertise. So I can
okay.
tell you sort of the quick version. And so I think that right now the consensus among anthropologists is that the native people that I study, right, the Plains, Miwok, and Valley Nisenan speaking people, they're both language groups are part of a larger language group called the Penutian language family. And linguists, anthropologists believe that Penutian speaking people arrive in California from really the Pacific Northwest, the Columbia River Basin,
Alaska
and
or
Oregon, Washington, about I think like 10,000 years, 12,000 years ago. And the current sort of modern Penutian language groups begin to emerge about 2,000 years ago. So folks by 2,000 years ago are settling down, differentiating into different specific languages that are like almost like the modern versions of those languages.
Yeah.
So a long time.
So did they have any specific religion, or did they have that they worship, like you know, the Aztec had or the Mayans had? And did
Yeah,
they
so
have anything like this?
one of the really interesting things about Indigenous California is how similar cultures are kind of across the state. There are sort of regions where, like in the northwestern part of California on the coast, there's a lot of commonality, and that's different, say, from the societies of the San Joaquin Valley, so the southern Central Valley of California. But probably those groups are a little bit more alike than those societies are with, say, Native people in the desert Southwest, right? So there's a lot of commonality across the board, and one of the common features of many California Indigenous societies is animistic sort of religious practice, the idea that nature is infused with spiritual forces. One of the common aspects of this religious tradition is the idea that that Coyote is a creator figure. So for Plains Miwok speaking people, one of the creation stories has to do with Coyote creating human beings. Now, Coyote is a trickster, right? I don't know if you're familiar with coyotes. I think coyotes are a North American
A
animal.
little bit. I know the animal, but not
So
enough.
coyotes are kind of like pesty, like they're pest type animals, right? They eat your trash. They get on your property. People are always trying to get rid of coyotes, right? They're like raccoons or skunks or something. Like you want them gone.
Yeah.
They're gonna mess with your pets. They eat cats sometimes. Like they're varmints, as we say, in the Southeast. So, you know, Coyote's like this trickster figure. He's naughty. He eats garbage, right? He bothers people. And so Coyote created human beings, right? That's a common aspect, a common creation story across many California Indian societies. So Coyote is a big figure. And as far as religious practice, shamans, particularly shamanic practices related to healthcare. So like there was a real strong tie in their cosmology, in their religious tradition between the health of people's bodies and sort of spiritual forces outside of people's bodies. So a lot of religious practice was really almost like healthcare practice. Like how do you cure people of diseases, right? How do you get these bad forces out of people's bodies?
This wasn't like what? How do you say? Like magical thing. You heal your hand by doing like this, putting them together and just rubbing the body. You're healed. It was more like scientific, or was it?
You know, that's a good question. And this is not something I know enough about the specifics of the practice to know how based in science that it might have been. But I do know that one of the leading causes of disease in this shamanic practice was witchcraft, right? So the idea that somebody would have cursed you in some way. And so the idea of like finding the witch, figuring out the source of the witch's power, breaking that power. So a little bit different than the more modern idea of faith healing or laying of hands to cure somebody. it was really more about figuring out who's the witch, how are they getting at this person, how are they hurting this
Yeah.
person, and taking away that power. And I don't know what the success rates would have been for shamanic practices. Yeah, I wish I knew.
So they didn't have like a god like like I don't know, compare the Aztec again. They didn't have a god like they did, or did they have? They looked at the Toyota as a kind of a god-like figure.
Yeah, he was. That's tough, right? Because God kind of, or the idea of God or gods gives the impression of a figure who has outsized power or like absolute power over human
Yeah,
beings and human affairs. And I'm not sure that we would say that certainly the Plains Miwok speaking communities and the Valley Nisenan speakers, I'm not sure that they had a full-on God type figure. What there were a lot of different natural figures associated with the natural world who had a lot of power, but none with absolute power. Even Coyote, who created human beings, didn't have absolute power over human beings.
yeah. They were. It's not like the Islam where you're not allowed to kill the pigs, for example, because eat or kill pigs because they're dirty. They should kill coyotes in that sense.
That's a good question. I don't know. I'm gonna look that up now. I don't know. I feel like it would be hard.
So it wasn't like
I
a
feel like it would be
sacred
hard to get
animal.
away with. Yeah, I don't know that Coyote was sacred in that way, because he was also a pest. He was a trickster.
Yeah,
He would try to mess people up, right? He created chaos. So he wasn't just a creator of humanity and a creator of life. He was also a creator of chaos. Bad things happened, right? Because Coyote was a pest. That's a good question. I'm gonna have to check that out.
So, what was the communication like? I'm talking before the California Gold Rush, like with other tribes. Did they get along well, or did they have wars between them on their own?
Yeah, one of the really interesting things about, and I think that more and more scholars are kind of exploring this theme for Native societies throughout North America, the extent to which like Native territories overlap, right? So the sense, like, if you're, say you're a Plains Miwok speaker, and you're from a particular village in the southern part of the Sacramento River Delta.
Yeah,
Well, your closest neighbors might not be other Plains Miwok speakers. Your closest neighbors might be Yokut speakers or Bay Miwok speakers, people who don't speak the same language as you. So you might actually have like closer ties with people who are not part of your broader cultural and language group than you do with other folks who are culturally and linguistically more like you.
yeah,
So there was a lot of intermarriage between communities, neighboring societies, because
yeah.
sometimes you were just closer to those societies than to others within your group. So people were pretty cosmopolitan, I think, much more so than I think the popular stereotype of Native Americans
Yeah.
would have you believe. And of course, being that we're talking about people who lived along one of the major rivers in California, the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta is the major river system in Northern California. These are folks who are accustomed to travel over long distances. They're skilled with using with boats and canoes to travel. So these are folks who know more about the world than just what's in their own backyard, and know more about the people who are out there than
Yeah.
just what's in their own backyard.
So did they have any rituals, like any specific rituals that you could talk about?
Yeah, so I can talk very generally about a couple of things. So one is the sweat lodge. The sweat lodge ceremonies were a pretty key part of very many California Indian sort of spiritual practices and ritual practices. And so I think people generally know what a sweat lodge is, right? Like you go into an
Yeah.
enclosed space, and a fire creates steam, and then everybody gets super hot, and then you leave the sweat lodge and ideally go
Like
jump into
like
a
a
river or a
sauna kind
lake.
of.
It's like a sauna, but then when you're done, you go jump in cold water.
Yeah.
It like shocks the
Yeah.
system. Um, so that was definitely a pretty common practice. Um, I do know
Was there
that,
any reason behind this, or did you just enjoyed doing this?
so again, like, you know how there's that connection between like sort of healthcare and
Yeah,
spiritual practice. So the sweat lodge is probably a good example of that, like something that is supposed to be healthy for your body, but also like put you in a mindset, almost like an altered state of consciousness, I would
yeah,
think, right? Because of being in the heat and in the steam. So, you know, those two things go together. Another common ritual practice, and I'm less clear on this, that folks from the communities that I study were involved in this practice, but further to the south, um, there was a type of plant that, when processed properly, would give you like hallucinations. It created
yeah.
hallucinogenic effects. And this plant, it's called Jimson weed, and the ceremony that went along with it was, certainly Spanish missionaries hated it and thought that it was devil worship and deviant and destructive. But the whole point of the ceremony was to put you in an altered state of consciousness, right? Um, so that was common further south, more in central and southern California.
Yeah.
Um, and then things like the coyote dance. I have never seen a coyote dance. I couldn't tell you the specifics of a coyote dance. But in the region that I study, almost every group has some version of a coyote dance,
Yeah.
which makes sense, right? Coyote's the creator.
But
So those are a few things that I know about.
yeah, so it's well known that the Native Americans moved around and not seasonal. Did they do this in California as well? And what was one reason for moving around? Like, why did they have to move around when they did?
So California's Native communities are really interesting historically, because there is some mobility, because at different times of the year, different resources are available in different places, right? And they're hunter gatherers, and so they naturally are going to want to go to where those resources are located
Yeah,
and take advantage of them, right? So fishing in certain times of year, plants that are ripening in other times of year. But California has like this really rare combination of factors that make it possible, at least in my region that I study, they make it possible for Indigenous people to be sedentary. And that's not terribly common among hunter gatherers to be able to be sedentary. But California, at least Northern California, where I study, has two things. It has salmon, which is bountiful, and you can preserve it. So people are able to lay by huge stores of preserved salmon, you know, to sustain them during months when other food sources aren't very productive.
yeah.
And the other thing that they have, and this is probably maybe the bigger thing, is they have acorns. So California has just such a variety of different species of oak trees. And the Central Valley of California, in particular, has some varieties of oak tree that are really productive.
Was
And
this for syrup or was it?
so you would collect acorns from the oak trees, and you had to process them correctly, and leach out some of the bitter sort of tannins, like stuff that's in wine that makes wine a little bit bitter.
Yeah,
You would have to leach that out. But once you'd done that, you could make it into a flour. You could grind the acorns into a flour and make bread. You could thicken soups. You could make cakes. You know, almost any kind of bread type product that you might think of, from ground up acorns. And I mean, those literally grow on trees. Like they
yeah.
literally fall off trees. So there's this ability to be hunter gatherers, but still take advantage of this tremendous natural bounty. And then, you know, all the other things that you might think of, that that types of plant resources and animal resources, from deer to antelope to rabbits to you know, berries, root plants, you know, all these kinds of things that people could take advantage of, resources they could exploit. But salmon and acorns meant that most California Native society, at least in the area that I study, Native societies could be sedentary because you can store acorns and you can store dried salmon.
Was acorn a seasonal product or was it all year round?
So it's a seasonal product. There is one period of the year when acorns drop from oak trees, but they're storable. So you just gather them up and you store them, typically in underground pits, sometimes in granaries that would be built kind of above ground.
Yeah.
And that would be there for you all year round. California also has the advantage of not having winter. There's a rainy season and there's a dry season, but there isn't, there's not like a season where things don't grow.
Yeah.
So the natural abundance year round would have been
So
a
that
huge
don't, so
asset.
they didn't have to move around like a lot of other tribes had to.
No, and you might have seasonal hunting camps or seasonal gathering camps, right? So maybe the manzanita berries don't grow in your backyard, so you might have to go to somebody else's backyard to get them. So you might have groups of people that would go when those berries were coming into season, but the whole village wouldn't have to relocate. So these are people who are accustomed to staying in one place
Right.
pretty much year round.
So did it grow anything on like wheat, like in the ground, or did it just
So
gather from hunting and fishing
yeah,
and
so the
acorn?
idea of people being hunter gatherers is kind of a misnomer. I think that to some extent, any society that we think of as being a hunter-gatherer society is tending their natural resources. They might not be planting crops, but they are actively managing their environment to make sure that those resources are available to them. So for Native Californians, one of the things that they did very frequently in almost all regions of California to help increase the yield of acorns, to help kill off the pests that would harm acorns, to clear out the underbrush, make room for new oak trees to grow, create better habitat for deer and antelope, was burn. So they would have like fires, like controlled burns, where they would target, okay, this is a region where we want to make sure we light a fire, clear out the underbrush, clear out all the insect pests
Yeah.
that would attack what we want. Make this area a place where new growth will start to emerge that will attract deer and antelope and elk. So fire was one of the main tools that Indigenous Californians used to manage their landscape. So it's not agriculture like we think of it, but it definitely, the landscape of Indigenous California was not an accident. It was very, very carefully managed by human beings, to the point where there are certain varieties of oak tree that I won't say that they absolutely need fire in order for their acorns to germinate, but fire, like they've evolved in tandem with human fires. That fire actually increases the likelihood that these trees can grow and produce, produce baby trees.
Right. So it's well known that California, it was forest fires, seasonal
Mm-hmm.
forest fires. Was this a thing back in the day as well, or how did this affect the indigenous tribes?
So one of the things that California's fire management officials are learning these days is that when California began suppressing indigenous fire management, it created the disaster that we see today, with California having these regular devastating wildfires. And it's not the only reason that these fires happen today, but it's a major contributing factor. So instead of having every year different areas having controlled burns, right? Especially clearing out that underbrush, which is so flammable. So if you remove the controlled burns and you allow this underbrush to build up, it's going to go up at some point, right? And when it goes up, it's not going to be manageable by human beings anymore.
Yeah.
Right? What would have been a small manageable fire now becomes a huge one that you can't manage.
Yeah.
So when you add into that climate change, and you add into that just the population pressure, people are building houses in places that are hazardous. They're just not safe places from a standpoint of fire safety to be building homes. And then you have a recipe for these huge fires that are so devastating. So, you got to be careful about like romanticizing the way that that Native people, Indigenous people anywhere in the world manage their environment, because fire is dangerous and people get hurt by it. and it kills animals and it kills plants. So I don't want to convey the impression that there were only positive environmental consequences from setting fires, right, from this type of land management strategy. But overall, it was probably the most important tool that Indigenous people used in California to make the environment work for them.
Was it devastating for the tribe if there was a forest fire if a forest fire happened? Because they didn't have the tools to take them out as we have today, I imagine.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I can't think of any evidence that I know of that would have documented Indigenous people's responses to a forest fire. Now, it doesn't mean that evidence doesn't exist. It just means I haven't come across it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. You're asking good questions.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But yeah, okay, so let's go back to the California gold rush, and they send them to reservations, I imagine. How does this affect the indigenous tribe? How do they react to this?
So this was the topic of my very first ever published article for the Journal of Genocide Research in 2004.
Interesting.
Yeah, so at first there was real reluctance after the gold rush first kicks off. The state of California is very reluctant to commit to a reservation strategy. So they're begging the US government for help. California officials are saying, you need to send some Indian agents in here to do something because this isn't working. There's constant violence, there's constant, really it's gold miners and also ranchers just killing Indigenous people all the time in California, just overwhelming violence. And their miners and ranchers are like, state of California, you need to do something. You need to help us out. You know, these Indians are stealing our cattle, or these Indians are interfering with our mining. They're stealing our stuff. And the more miners and ranchers come into California, the less Indigenous people are able to make a living because they no longer can hunt and gather on land that has been claimed by white settlers as private property.
Yeah.
And mining is literally ruining the rivers. So the salmon that people would rely on, to get them through the year, as miners are panning in these rivers, and especially increasingly as the 1850s go into the 1860s, as hydraulic mining becomes a major practice, where they just aim these high-powered jets of water at hillsides and mountainsides and blast away all the dirt, which then can later on be sifted and panned for gold. This just ruins salmon runs in California rivers throughout the gold producing regions and downriver from the gold producing regions. So Native people get desperate, and when desperate people need to eat, they're going to steal. That's just the way it works. So miners and ranchers are like, they're stealing all our stuff.
But whose fault is it?
Sorry?
But whose fault is that?
Well,
whose fault is it that they are stealing?
If you're going to come and set up camp on land that doesn't belong to you, that belongs to somebody else, yeah, like this is, and it's not that people didn't recognize this. This is what's so perplexing and awful about this period of time. Everybody knew why Indians were stealing livestock and supplies from miners and ranchers. Everybody knew. You could see that Native people were starving. Like, people were starving to death, and it was visible to everybody.
It was basically a concentration camp they lived in.
Well, so when the United States finally sends some Indian agents into California, they're like, all right, we're going to negotiate these treaties to get these Native people to give up their lands where they're in danger because there are miners and ranchers that want to kill them, and move to reservations where they'll be protected and we could promise them food and supplies. So they go through California in 1851 and 1852, and they negotiate all these treaties of removal with various tribes in the affected areas. And then they take their treaties back to Washington, D.C., to the capital of the US. And any treaty that's negotiated on behalf of the United States has to be ratified by the United States Senate. And when these treaties are presented to the Senate for ratification, California's congressional delegation manages to convince enough people, like, no, don't sign these treaties. There could be gold on any of this land. We don't want to give any of it up.
Yeah.
Trust us, don't sign these treaties. And so in 1852, the United States Senate refused to ratify these treaties. And so left with nowhere to go, California's native population they were like sitting ducks. So in these regions that were, in the gold mining regions and attached to the gold mining regions, well, then there's just overwhelming violence and nobody even attempting to stop it. The state of California empowers militias to go into these regions for the purpose of killing Indians. If any of your listeners are curious to know more about this era, my colleague and friend Benjamin Madley recently has published a book, but it's maybe a couple years old. I'm old. A couple years old seems recent to me. But he recently published a book called An American Genocide. And I think the subtitle is The California Indian Catastrophe. I might be playing fast and loose with the title, but he painstakingly documents this entire process of how all these events go down and its consequences for Native people. So it's like a madhouse. It's just open genocidal violence against Indigenous Californians throughout the 1850s. Eventually, the state of California agrees that a reservation is necessary. And so the Office of Indian Affairs establishes a reservation in Round Valley, California, which is a very, very remote part of Northern California, in the mountains between the Central Valley and the coast. And, people are removed to Round Valley. Indian people are removed to Round Valley, in many cases against their will. And then it does become like a concentration camp. The conditions there are very bad. Because one of the things that the United States, with its Indian policy, likes to do is promise Native people, yes, if you just give up everything you have and go over here to this reservation, we'll take care of you, but then not spend any money to actually do the caretaking.
There weren't only just one tribe in this reservation, right? There were many.
Multiple. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this is one of the problems often in regions like California, where you have a lot of different tribal territories that overlap and a lot of people living next to each other and stuff like that, is that you end up establishing a reservation and then it's like, all right, put any Indian on this reservation. Just go out and get all the Indians you can and put them on this reservation. But what they don't take into account is like sometimes people aren't friends. Sometimes this community has been historically at odds with this other community and they've been in a state of warfare for as long as anybody can remember. And then those become really explosive and negative situations on reservations. So it was definitely the same for Round Valley.
Do you have an idea of what life was like inside? You talked a little bit about it more in depth of what this was like inside the reservation.
Yeah, so one of the goals for Indian reservations, pretty much always in the United States in this period of time, was to transform Native people from hunter-gatherers into farmers. Sometimes this is really comical because sometimes the Native people in question are already farmers. And so you're like, this is crazy. Like,
just not in our sense.
Yeah. Just, yeah. Or yeah, like they don't farm the crops we want them to farm, or they farm, but also hunt, but we're going to concentrate on the hunting and not pay attention to the farming. So the idea is that they become farmers like their white farming neighbors. But if you ever have the opportunity, you probably won't, because Round Valley is so remote. I grew up in Northern California. I lived there for most of my life, and I went to Round Valley once, right? So it's not a place that people often have a huge opportunity to go to, but it's remote. When I went to Round Valley in 2009, visiting some friends who lived out there, and there is one gas pump in town, and the next nearest gas pump is 2.5 hours away over a mountain pass. And the gas pump was broken, and we almost thought we weren't going to be able to leave Round Valley until we could figure out, until they could figure out how to fix this gas pump.
It's like Hotel California, you can come, but you can never leave.
Exactly. Yes, that's a good analogy. So it's extremely remote, and it's I feel like the major agricultural exports of Round Valley today. So with all of the modern agriculture and science can do. I feel like Round Valley today produces cattle and it produces marijuana. And those are the two like key, and cattle can subsist on really marginal lands. And of course, marijuana could be grown on extremely marginal lands of all sorts.
Marijuana is legal in California now, right?
Yes. So even today, there's not a lot that you can do profitably in Round Valley, right? So you can imagine to take folks who have very little to no agricultural expertise. I mean, or maybe they do have agricultural expertise, but not here, not in Round Valley, not in these conditions. And then tell them, yeah, now you need to sink or swim. You need to farm this really marginal, unproductive land or starve. But also, we don't really have tools, or at least not as many tools as you're going to need. We don't really have much to keep you going until your crops are harvestable, right? So you're not going to be eating enough for the next year until these crops are going to be harvested. We're going to put you in a situation where there's a possibility for high conflict with your neighbors, right? Because friends and enemies are all thrown in together. People are starving and desperate and competing over limited resources. So yeah, there were definitely instances of folks trying to escape Round Valley, right? Attempting to escape, to go, like, really do anything, anywhere, find work somewhere else, leave the reservation just to hunt, to see if somewhere else had something that you could hunt for food. So it was a really hard life, and the agents who administered Round Valley, just like anywhere else in North America, were a mix of people who cared and attempted to get resources for the Native people who were under their care, and people who didn't care, people who were just like,
it's profits.
Yeah, I'm getting my salary from the US government. I'm not going to worry about this. So yeah, those kind of reservation conditions. And, you hear sometimes in history about, oh, people starved to death, or there was a famine and people starved to death, or the reservation didn't have enough provisions and people starved to death. But if you could see what starving to death actually looked like, that concentration camp analogy is really apt. Because, yeah, I mean, if you starve to death, literally you have gotten to the point where you're so emaciated that your muscles will not work to expand your diaphragm and allow you to breathe, right? That's what it means to starve to death, or more likely to be so malnourished that other diseases take you first. So the scenario for people living under these conditions is pretty horrific.
Is that a case of many reservations today in 2021, or?
So one of the hard parts about being a Native American historian, or a historian of Native North America, is that Native people in North America are so diverse and their historical experiences are so diverse that you almost can't speak with any authority and say yes or no, it was this way or that way. But I'll say this: I don't think that the type of starvation that we would have seen at Round Valley in, say, the 1860s is what people experience commonly on reservations in the United States anymore. Now, that doesn't mean that malnourishment and food scarcity and food insecurity are not a part of reservation life. They absolutely are, right? Because those are the conditions of poverty in the United States, right? And poverty does tend to be concentrated in many cases on reservations. Usually the statistic that people are most familiar with would be something like the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, where the Lakota people, one of the reservations for the Lakota people, where there's like an 80% unemployment rate. Like, unemployment is overwhelmingly the norm, right? Those are the types of places where malnutrition, food insecurity, scarcity, like those kind of things continue to be a problem.
Yeah.
But not to the same sort of ghastly extent that we would have seen in Round Valley.
What is life like on the reservation
and Round Valley
today?
is still a reservation today, right? Like, there's parts of Round Valley.
Can you tell us a little bit about what
I can
life is
only
like?
speak. Yeah, so like I said, I visited Round Valley once. So my experience of seeing Round Valley today is not comprehensive and not especially well informed, but you know, it's a poor rural part of California, and California has a lot of rural poverty. So that's, you know, completely consistent with other parts. Yeah, I would say that it had perhaps compared with other parts of rural California, maybe fewer people of means and more, you know, the greater percentage of the population was impoverished. But yeah, it very much had the feel of a poor rural California town.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming. I think we covered the most basic of the Native American tribes in California. Do you have anything you wish to promote? Anything you wish me to put in the description?
Can I self-promote?
Yeah, of course.
So if you're interested at all in knowing more about the research that I've done and the stuff that I've published, I wanted to make a plug for two recent publications. One, I have a chapter out in an edited collection, a volume called Violence and Indigenous Communities, Confronting the Past, Engaging the Present. It's out with Northwestern University Press. So please check that out if you can. Ask your library to order it, even better. And also an article that I recently published in the journal, the Pacific Historical Review. So if you have access to academic journal databases, that's one to check out. The article is called Trapped. And it is in the winter 2021 issue of the Pacific Historical Review. So check those out. The more you Google me, the happier I am. So.
Do you have any social media you wish me to plug in, or any where people can find you?
Oh, not unless all you want to see is pictures of my kids and my cats. Yeah, unfortunately, I am too old to have been fully fluent with social media. So I don't. Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's all right. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah.
This has been Well.H12. We are taking a look inside the indigenous tribe of California. Next week, we'll actually take a look at what it's like to become an historian. Does it take to document what a modern historian today works like versus before, 1,000 years before. And if you want to find us, we are available on Instagram at Well.H12. We are also exclusively on Stereo, which is a new podcast app where I interview not just historians, but people from all sort of life. This Sunday, we're going to discuss the infamous Snyder Cut from Zack Snyder's Justice League, so definitely check us out there. We are also on That's Not Canon Productions, which we will link down below. Thank you so much for coming. This has been Well.H12. I see you next Thursday. My name is Alan. Thank you for coming.